Hello. So in this first video celebrating Black History Month 2022, we're going to talk about the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, as written by himself. More typically just referred to as the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. So I have read this in its entirety in the past, but for my purposes today I'm working out of the excerpts in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So, Olaudah Equiano was born around 1745, according to the introduction here, in the Niger River Delta area of present-day Nigeria. Kidnapped by local raiders around the age of 11, he was carried to the coast and sold into slavery. So, Equiano spent most of his life as a slave, typically on ships. So rather than being sold into sugar plantations in the Caribbean or cotton plantations in what would become the southern United States, Equiano largely remained on ships. And that's actually one of the interesting things about his narrative, as opposed to a lot of other slave narratives, because he has this kind of Horatio Alger component to his story, where, like, one of the things he does is he talks about becoming this sort of small-time trader, where he would he accumulated like a bag of oranges or something like this by trading various things. And actually, I think at one point, like, his bag of oranges gets stolen, and it's like all his worldly goods are gone and stuff like this. But he basically sort of creates a small fortune for himself by doing this sort of independent trading as the ship moves from place to place. So that's a really cool element of the story that kind of builds into the anti-slavery aspect of the interesting narrative, because it shows that he has initiative, it shows that he has reason, rationality, cognitive capacity, and all of these things that were prized in Enlightenment era Europe. And that's ultimately his audience here, especially Enlightenment era Britain. So this era that values intelligence, that values reason, that values human liberty, individual rights, and things like this. Equiano's narrative is all about proving that he has those abilities, he has those capabilities. And because he does, other Africans may, because Equiano is not necessarily going to sort of, in the 18th century, he's not necessarily going to say all Africans have this, although today we would recognize that all people, regardless of race or ethnicity, have the same potential for rationality, for intelligence, for various types of aptitudes, etc., etc. These things are not contingent on race or ethnicity. But this is ultimately an anti-slavery narrative, and it very overtly is so. And Equiano starts essentially with an anti-slavery statement of purpose. So from the very beginning of the narrative, this is a very common 18th century, early 19th century thing as well. He has this sort of preface where he writes, "To the Lords spiritual and temporal and the commons of the Parliament of Great Britain, my lords and gentlemen, permit me with the greatest deference and respect to lay at your feet the following genuine narrative, the chief design of which is to excite in your august assemblies a sense of compassion for the miseries which the slave trade has entailed on my unfortunate countrymen. By the horrors of that trade I was first torn away from all the tender connections that were naturally dear to my heart. But these, through the mysterious ways of Providence, I ought to regard as infinitely more than compensated by the introduction I have thence obtained to the knowledge of the Christian religion, and of a nation which, by its liberal sentiments, its humanity, the glorious freedom of its government, and its proficiency in arts and sciences, has exalted the dignity of human nature. I am sensible I ought to entreat your pardon for addressing to you a work so wholly devoid of literary merit, but as the production of an unlettered African who is actuated by the hope of becoming an instrument toward the relief of his suffering countrymen, I trust that such a man, pleading in such a case, will be acquitted of boldness and presumption. May the God of heaven inspire your spirits with peculiar benevolence on that important day when the question of abolition is to be discussed, when thousands, in consequence of your determination, are to look for happiness or misery. I am, my lords and gentlemen, your most obedient and devoted humble servant, Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, Union Street, Marylebone, March 24th, 1789. So again, in a way, this is a generic kind of thing to put at the beginning of an 18th century narrative, especially a personal narrative. This sort of humility of, oh, this work is utterly unworthy of being read, and things like this, is a generic convention, but it's also a rhetorical convention. Because what Equiano is doing here is saying, oh, I know that as an African, we see this actually a lot with female authors as well during this period. Oh, as a feeble-minded woman, I know that whatever I've written is gonna suck, but then you read it and you're like, wow, this is actually amazing. Like, clearly this is someone with intelligence, with reason, with an ability to express themselves in an effective way. So you've got, it's a rhetorical technique. Essentially, you play down your abilities so that when the merits of the work speak for themselves, it's that much more impressive, and it gives you that much more rhetorical authority. But it's also worth noting here, particularly, that Equiano is going to talk about the horrors of the slave trade. And that's worth noting because the slave trade was abolished earlier in both Britain and the US than slavery itself was. And Equiano's narrative actually probably played a significant role in shaping public opinion and political opinion against the slave trade. And I will talk about some of the things Equiano says about it. But this is one of the key objectives of Equiano's narrative, is to support the abolition of the slave trade as such. Now, the other interesting thing in terms of Equiano downplaying his literary abilities is actually the beginning of chapter 1 starts with another generic convention of 18th century literature, which is, here's the kinds of things that people typically expect from a memoir like this. And this shows that Equiano is actually well read. He's aware of not only the generic conventions, but of what audiences are likely to expect, what his readers are likely to expect. And in some ways, he does shape his narrative for those expectations. So again, this is Equiano on a very subtle and effective way, giving us the evidence of his intelligence and his ability to be a sophisticated author. So, one of the first things that we get in the narrative is actually a sort of ethnographic picture of West African cultures. There's a lot that Equiano says about this. He talks about the importance of dance and music. He talks about gender relations. He talks about clothing. He talks about the ways in which political authority is organized. And this is all very interesting and significant in terms of understanding West African culture, but we should also be somewhat cautious about this portion of the narrative because Equiano was about 11 years old when he was taken by slave traders. So it's possible that as an 11-year-old, he was out there, or prior to being 11, he was out there doing ethnographic studies of his native culture, but it's reasonably unlikely. It's possible that he's picked up additional information about West African cultures by going and visiting again as part of his travels on the ships where he was a slave. But we should be somewhat skeptical, particularly since a lot of the comparisons that he makes between West African cultures, he makes a lot of comparisons between West African cultures and the biblical Hebrews, the biblical Jews. That is also a rhetorical technique. He's writing to a Christian audience who would be very well versed in the Bible, who would see the biblical Hebrews as a righteous people worthy of respect. And so the connections that he makes here are effectively rhetorical because they link Africans, who are not respected by Europeans at this time as legitimate and worthy civilizations, cultures, nations, etc., with the ancient Hebrews who were respected in those ways. So this is an important linkage he's doing. And actually, this is one of the cool things about the narrative, is almost everything in it is shaped specifically for this objective of undermining the legitimacy of the slave trade and undermining the legitimacy of racial bias in his audience. So let's turn to chapter 2, which is one of the most brutal chapters probably in all of literature. This is where we get the description of the middle passage, and it ends with the description of the slave market. Fair warning, this is extremely rough. I'm going to give you a section that is bad, but not necessarily the most graphic or violent section. So this occurs shortly after... So Equiano is captured by slave traders. He's brought to the coast, and there he sees a ship for the first time, and he's brought on board this slave trading ship. He says, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that, with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for that last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I've never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element the first time I saw it, yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I've seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating." So, I mean, this chapter, chapter 2, really, I think, would have done a number on the reading public of 18th century Britain, because of how horrific it is. I mean, Equiano here is recounting being violently ill from both seasickness and the stench of the hold in which the slaves are kept. And because he can't eat, he's physically incapable of eating the food that the crew tries to force him to eat. He's severely whipped to the point where suicide becomes preferable to remaining in slavery. And he says here he has seen a number of people attempt suicide, a number of slaves attempt suicide on these voyages. It's brutality, and again, for an English reading public in the 18th century, early 19th century, this would have been devastating, you have to imagine. So we get that severe pathos impact on the reader that's going to be extraordinarily effective for achieving Equiano's goal, which again is the abolition of the slave trade, if not slavery itself. And then the last portion of chapter 2, I actually think has one of the best passages. It's brutal, it's terrible, horrific, again, but I think it has one of the best passages in all of anti-slavery literature. So he's describing here the sale of slaves in a slave market. He says, on a signal given as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make choice of that parcel they like best. The noise and clamor with which this is attended, and the eagerness visible in the countenances of the buyers, serve not a little to increase the apprehension of the terrified Africans, who may well be supposed to consider them as the ministers of that destruction to which they think themselves devoted. Slightly earlier than this, he had talked about how the enslaved Africans often fear that they're going to be eaten by their enslavers. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. I remember in the vessel in which I was brought over, in the men's apartment, there were several brothers, who in the sale were sold in different lots, and it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries at parting. O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would have them, as you would men should do unto you? Is it not that we are torn? Is it not enough that we are torn from our countrymen and friends to toil for your luxury and lust for gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice? Are the dearest friends and relations, now rendered more dear by their separation from their kindred, still to be parted from each other, and thus prevented from cheering the gloom of slavery with the small comfort of being together and mingling their suffering and sorrows? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors to the wretchedness of slavery. So this technique, this rhetorical technique here of, this line, O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? That appeal to Christian sentiments and the idea that Christianity should fundamentally teach an anti-slavery message. That becomes really, really central in anti-slavery literature, as well as this idea of the importance of family. Why should slave families be subject to being broken up in this way? Isn't it better to maintain families, to keep the structure of the family intact for these enslaved people? These are very common anti-slavery techniques that we get in both anti-slave trade literature like Equiano's narrative, but also in later out-and-out anti-slavery literature when the cause shifts from abolition of the slave trade to abolition of slavery as such. And again, Equiano is such an important model for this type of literature, partially because he does these rhetorical techniques so very well and so very convincingly.